Hello, weary traveller. Come, sit by my fire. The night is long, and the stars above hold many secrets. I am the lonely knight, and tonight I shall share with you an account about the burdened path walked by women in the Middle Ages. A time when law, faith, and daily life bound them in silence and servitude, from birth to grave. Close your eyes, if you will, and let your mind drift back with me. Back to a time when the world was simpler, yet far more perilous. When a man's word was his bond, and steel sang its deadly song under the morning sun. But before we begin, tell me, fellow wanderer, from what distant land do you listen? And what time does your clock strike as my account reaches you? It brings me comfort to know when and where my voice is heard. I recall the world as it was, shaped by a firm and ancient order, one where the man stood as the pillar of law, land, and lineage, and the woman, more often than not, lived beneath his shadow. From the moment a girl opened her eyes to the thatch and stone of her family's roof, she was told what her life would be: obedient daughter, dutiful wife, enduring mother. Her fate was not a matter of becoming, but of accepting. The world did not ask what she dreamed. Her lessons were few but clear. Keep your voice low, your head lower, and your loyalty to the house of your father until it transferred to your husband. Her name changed, but her submission did not. If she were noble, she was property in velvet. If she were poor, she toiled beside beasts of burden. But rank never excused her from the same chains, only changed their metal. In the courts, men decided the laws. In the markets, men held the coin. In the church, men wore the robes. A woman, even when wise or capable, was considered less by nature. Her mind too fickle, they said, her body too tempting, her purpose too plain. And so the rhythm of power beat only to a masculine drum, one she was taught to follow, never lead. Marriage was not an escape, but a transfer of command. Her father's will was simply replaced by that of a husband, often older, often chosen for gain rather than affection. Even her body did not belong to her. It was part of a contract, sealed with a blessing and bound by law. To refuse a husband's demand, even in the quiet of night, was seen as rebellion. The clergy taught it so. Eve had sinned, they reminded all, and women bore her stain. Thus, obedience was not merely expected, it was sacred. Disobedience, on the other hand, was whispered of in the same breath as sorcery. And so the quiet woman, the unseen woman, was the good woman. Her silence kept the world in balance, they claim. But I have seen that silence cost much. I have watched mothers bury daughters who never knew laughter, and wives retreat into corners of stone where hope could not reach them. Their strength was never named strength, their endurance never called courage. Yet they bore the weight of the world while being told they were too frail to lift it. There were exceptions, of course. A few noble women ruled when widowed. Some abbesses held sway within stone walls, and merchants' wives ran shops when their husbands travelled. But these were ripples, not tides. They did not rewrite the order, only proved how tightly it was written. Most women lived and died without ever being asked what they thought. So it was, in the villages I passed and the castles I served. The law was written by men's hands and sealed with their swords, while women bore the consequences in silence. Their story was not carved in oak or recorded on parchment. It was lived, painfully, invisibly, and left behind in worn hands, hollow eyes, and lullabies whispered into the dark. In those days, the church was the breath of every village. It governed our thoughts as surely as the king governed our lands. And within its stone walls and Latin chants, a woman's worth was weighed not in wisdom, nor in kindness, but in her likeness to two biblical figures, Eve and Mary. One cursed the world with sin, the other redeemed it through silence and purity. Between them, no space was left for the woman who simply lived. The priests spoke from pulpits carved with angels and demons, and their words were law wrapped in holy robes. Eve's fall, they taught, was proof that woman was weak, easily deceived, and a threat to divine order. She had tempted Adam, they claimed, and thus every woman since bore that same danger in her flesh. To trust a woman was to risk the ruin of a soul. This belief did not merely linger in sermons, it seeped into daily life. Mary, on the other hand, was upheld as the unreachable ideal, virgin, mother, silent servant of God. She was praised not for what she said, but for what she suffered. Women were told to model her obedience, her modesty, her self-denial, to desire joy, or to speak freely, or to question. These were marks of pride, of sin. In this way, holiness became a burden most women could never hope to bear. Confessionals became places not of comfort, but of judgment. Women whispered their faults, speaking too much, desiring too deeply, refusing their husbands, and received penance for being human. They walked out with heads bowed, convinced their pain was a divine lesson. And when women wept in childbirth, or grieved in widowhood, they were reminded it was God's will, that suffering was sacred, even redemptive. The church also enforced laws on what women could wear, how they should walk, even where they might sit. In some parishes, women were made to stand apart from men, veiled or cloaked, lest their presence distract the faithful. And should one dare speak up, even in matters of faith, she was often silenced with shame, or worse, accused of heresy. I remember a nun in Burgundy, learned and wise, who copied manuscripts by candlelight. Her words shone with insight, yet when the abbot discovered her writings, he forbade her to continue. Too much thought, he said, makes a woman forget her place. She wept, not from punishment, but from the theft of her voice, a theft done in the name of God. Yet despite these chains, many women found quiet strength in their faith. Some sang hymns that softened grief, tended to the sick with gentle prayers, or found solace in the rhythm of rosary beads. But always, the path was narrow. The church offered a kind of sanctuary, but only if a woman accepted the role it assigned her and asked no more. And so the church did not merely shape souls, it sculpted silence. It molded womanhood into something small and still, wrapped in virtue, but void of power. And even as the bells tolled high above the fields, their echo served not only to call the faithful, but to remind every woman of the path she could not leave. I have witnessed many unions in my time, but few were born of love. In the medieval world, marriage was not a matter of the heart, it was a matter of land, name, and alliance. A girl could be promised before she learned to read, her future decided over bread and ink by men who measured her worth by dowry and bloodline. By the time she could carry water without spilling, her path was already carved in stone. Among nobles, marriages sealed treaties. Kings gave daughters like coins to cement peace or gain power. Among peasants, the arrangement was simpler, yet no less transactional, a way to combine fields, ease debts, or ensure a strong back for the next harvest. Rare was the girl who chose her groom. Rarer still was the man who asked her will. The exchange was spoken of as honor, but it was little more than barter. Consent was a shadowy thing. The church required it in word, yet few dared challenge a father's will or a priest's insistence. I once stood beside a lord's daughter, trembling in linen as she was wed to a man thrice her age. She never looked at him, only at the floor. Her hands shook so violently that the ring slid past her knuckle. No one noticed. They were already toasting the alliance. Even among common folk, a girl of 12 or 13 could become a wife, expected to manage a household before her body had finished becoming its own. Her husband, often older, already knew the world in ways she did not. And in that imbalance, harm often grew, quiet, unseen, and accepted. What could she say, and to whom? The law, the priest, even her mother would say, "It is the way of things." Love was not entirely unknown, of course. Some grew fond over time. A shared burden can soften hearts, but it was not expected, nor necessary. A wife was to serve, to bear, to obey. If affection blossomed, it was counted as a blessing, but never a right. And if cruelty came instead, she bore it in silence. Leaving was not an option, not without ruin. A man might take lovers and be whispered about with grins. A woman suspected of straying, even falsely, might be beaten, cast out, or worse. Fidelity was her duty. For him, it was a preference. Thus, marriage was not a union of equals, but of power and dependence. She brought her body and her labor. He brought his name and protection. Both knew their place, but only one was punished for forgetting it. Some women found small rebellions. A whispered no, a delayed task, a hidden coin saved. But these were embers, not flames. Most resigned themselves to duty. They prayed not for freedom, but for a kind husband, healthy children, and the strength to endure. And so they moved through the world with heads bowed, their names changed, their hopes buried under vows they never truly made. When I think of marriage now, I do not see garlands or kisses. I see parchment and signatures, nervous girls with downcast eyes, and mothers who smiled tightly through their daughters' weddings, remembering their own. For in that world, a woman's life could change with a single nod, not of her own head, but of another's hand. In the villages and manors I passed through, I seldom saw girlhood as we know it now. No carefree laughter beneath the trees, no idle games stretched under summer skies. A girl in the Middle Ages was not raised to dream, but to serve. As soon as her hands could grasp a broom or a spindle, they were set to work. Her playthings were chores, her lessons were obedience and endurance. By 7 or 8, many girls were tending infants, sweeping floors, and hauling water from wells deeper than their limbs were strong. There was no notion of innocence as a protected time. If she cried, she was scolded. If she hesitated, she was told to remember her future, a good wife, a good mother, nothing more. Her worth was measured not in joy or thought, but in usefulness. I remember one household where the youngest daughter, not yet 10, rose before the sun to knead dough for the day's bread. Her hands were red from cold, her eyes heavy with sleep. Yet she smiled when I spoke to her, proud to be needed. No one questioned it. Not her parents, not the priest, not even the child herself. It was simply the shape life gave her. Education was rare, and when given, it was shaped to her station. Noble girls might learn a little reading, sewing, perhaps Latin prayers. But knowledge beyond that was discouraged. For what use was learning to a wife? Among peasants, school was almost unheard of. The only letters most girls saw were those embroidered into linen, not inked on parchment. Their minds, like their voices, were kept quiet. Even their games mimicked the lives they were entering. I once saw girls pretending to marry dolls fashioned from cloth scraps. They mimed giving birth, baking bread, kneeling in prayer. There was no fantasy of being explorers, scholars, or knights. Their world did not permit such visions. The stories they heard of saints, queens, and brides all ended with sacrifice, not freedom. Some girls were betrothed before they could write their names. Promised by fathers eager for land or favor, they grew up knowing to whom they belonged, long before they understood what marriage meant. And when the time came, often before their bodies were ready, they were given away like goods, their girlhood swallowed by vows and veils. This early loss was not mourned, it was celebrated. A girl who became a woman swiftly was praised. One who lingered in childhood was seen as idle, and so even their tears were hurried. A scraped knee might be soothed, but sorrow at being married off or silenced was met with sternness. You must be strong, they were told. But no one asked what strength cost. Now, as I sit by this fire and hear the wind stir the branches above, I think of those girls. I wonder what dreams they once had, before the world taught them not to dream. Their laughter, if it ever came, was short-lived. For in those days, childhood for a girl was not a chapter. It was a whisper, soon lost to the wind. There is a silence I remember, a deep, trembling stillness that would fall over a home when a woman went into labor. Not the hush of reverence, but the kind born of dread. For in the Middle Ages, childbirth was not a joyful expectation. It was a perilous passage through pain and shadow. No physician waited with skillful hands, no comfort of clean linen or soothing draughts. Only the midwife came, often a neighbor, armed with prayers, herbs, and trembling resolve. The chamber would be dim, the air thick with sweat and smoke. Women gathered, whispering psalms or folk charms, their voices low to calm the laboring mother, or to steady themselves. There was no knowledge of infection, no understanding of blood loss. If the birth went poorly, and often it did, there was little to do but wait. I have stood outside such rooms and heard cries that grew weaker with each hour. Sometimes they ended in silence, sometimes in two. In noble halls or peasant huts, the danger was the same. Status could not buy safety from a torn womb or a baby turned the wrong way. A woman might bleed until the light faded from her eyes, and all the prayers of the church would not return her breath. Some survived only to develop fevers days later, what we now know as sepsis, their strength eaten away by unseen poison. And yet, it was expected. A woman bore children, often many, and if she died, it was seen as a holy offering. The church called it suffering in the likeness of Mary. The law saw no injustice. It was a duty fulfilled. Mourning was quiet, sometimes short, especially if she left behind mouths to feed. Another woman would take her place soon enough. Life did not pause for grief. The infant's fate was no more certain. Stillbirths were frequent, and many babies died within days, their tiny forms swaddled and buried before names were spoken. I recall one mother who held her lifeless child for hours, refusing to give him up. Her neighbors wept, but no one was surprised. Such stories were common. Pain was woven into the cradle itself. There were remedies, of course, teas, charms, whispered instructions passed from one midwife to another. But they were guesses, born of desperation. Sometimes they helped. More often, they merely gave hope where there was none. And should a woman cry too loud or resist the agony, she risked being seen as weak or sinful. The expectation was not survival, but submission. I have buried friends, companions, daughters of lords and farmers alike, all lost to this unrelenting trial. Their graves are many, their names often forgotten, yet their courage lives in my memory. For it was courage, though never called such. To face childbirth, then, was to walk alone into the dark, without promise of return, and with no one to name you brave. So when I see the fire flicker low and feel the cold edge of memory, I think of those women. Their cries still echo in stone and wood, in the silent corners of chapels and kitchens. They birthed a world that scarcely thanked them, and far too often buried them before they could watch it grow. When I speak of the women of my time, I must also speak of how briefly many of them walked this earth. It was not uncommon for a woman to die before her 35th year, not from war or plague, but from the quiet erosion of childbearing, hunger, and unending labor. Her life was spent in service, and often ended in the very act that defined her role, bringing forth life while risking her own. In village after village, I saw the same pattern. A girl became a wife before her bones had fully hardened. By the time she was 20, she might have already buried one child and carried another in her womb. Each birth wore her thin, not just in body, but in spirit. Her hips ached, her teeth loosened, her skin lost its bloom, and yet she was expected to endure, to smile, to serve her family without complaint. Few had the luxury of rest. There were no convalescent beds, no midwives with real training, no understanding of postpartum illness. If her womb tore or her milk failed, If she bled too long or fell into fever, there was no remedy beyond hope. And if she survived one childbirth, another was likely already on its way. It was a rhythm that offered no mercy, only repetition. I remember the wife of a blacksmith in Cornwall, a strong woman, taller than most, with hands calloused from helping in the forge. She bore 9 children in 12 years. Her 10th was stillborn, and she never rose again. The priest called her a martyr of the hearth, and neighbors brought bread and flowers. But behind the kindness, I saw resignation. They had seen it before. They would see it again. This quiet decimation was not marked with statues or songs. Men who died in battle were named heroes. Women who died in bed were barely whispered about. Their suffering was woven into the fabric of life, accepted as the price of continuity. Some even believed that such pain was noble, a form of sanctification through blood and sacrifice. But it was not noble. It was relentless. Even those who lived longer were often broken by their 30s. Their bodies bent from years of lifting, nursing, kneeling, their eyes dulled by loss. Few had time to mourn properly. Grief was worn beneath aprons, buried in lullabies, hidden in the corners of crowded homes. And in this silence, they carried a sorrow few would name, not just for what they lost, but for never having known ease. Among noble women, there was more shelter, but no true escape. They too were married young, expected to produce heirs, and judged for every miscarriage or delay. A queen might wear a crown, but she too bled and risked death like any milkmaid. Power did not soften the edge of childbirth, nor shield her from the same fragile hopes. And so, the candle of a woman's life often burned fast and low. She was taught to accept this, even to be proud of it. But I remember. I remember the mothers who did not wake, the sisters buried in frost, the wives who whispered goodbye with their final breath. They lived without rest and died without record. Yet they were the silent architects of every home we knew. Long before the rooster called the sun, a woman's day had already begun. She moved through shadows and ashes, stirring the hearth, drawing cold water from the well, grinding grain with aching arms while the world still slept. In the Middle Ages, her labor was the unseen engine of every household, constant, heavy, and unpraised. There was no distinction between duty and identity. To be a woman was to serve from waking breath to final sigh. She was cook, cleaner, nurse, and seamstress. She mended clothes by candlelight, kneaded bread with blistered hands, tended the ill with whispered prayers, and soothed crying babes while weaving baskets or spinning thread. And none of it was called work. Labor, they said, was the realm of men. A woman's tasks were expected, not acknowledged, part of her nature, like breathing. I have stayed in peasant huts where women moved like ghosts, never still, never idle. One tended a stew while bouncing a child on her hip. Another scrubbed floors with knees raw from straw. Even in noble halls, the demands were real, managing servants, organizing stores, overseeing feasts, embroidering endlessly. Leisure was a myth, found only in the dreams they were too tired to remember. No rest came in winter. The cold crept into stone walls, and still she fetched wood, patched cloaks, and kept the fire alive while frost bit her fingers. In summer, she rose with the sun and worked until it fell. Shoulders burned, hands cracked, sweat staining her gown. Illness did not excuse her, nor did pregnancy. Her body carried children and burdens alike, with no pause between. Her work sustained everyone but herself. The husband was praised for his toil in the field or forge. The children were taught to honor their father's labor, and yet the mother, who fed them, clothed them, healed their wounds, was rarely thanked. Her efforts were seen as natural, her exhaustion invisible. Should she complain, it was called weakness. Should she falter, the home unraveled. There was joy at times, laughter shared over kneading bowls, lullabies whispered into night, a daughter's helping hands. But even joy was tempered by duty. The spinning wheel never stopped, nor the need for food, nor the endless mending of what the world kept breaking. And as her body aged, stooped, and weathered, she worked on, because no one imagined a woman not working. I recall a widow who raised 6 children alone, her husband lost to a fever. She carried firewood through the snow each morning, her breath a ghost before her. Her sons grew strong, her daughters kind, and yet when she died, her grave bore no inscription. Just a wooden cross worn by wind and time. But I remember her. I remember how the village held together because of her hands. And so, the story of domestic labor is not one of idle hearths or peaceful days. It is a tale of constant motion, of unseen strength, of sacrifice without song. Women kept the world turning, not through war or words, but through the quiet rhythm of unending care, a rhythm that beat on, even when no one was listening. In my youth, I often heard it said that a woman's virtue lay in her silence. A good wife, they claimed, was one whose voice was heard rarely and softly, whose thoughts remained folded within, like linens pressed in a chest. To speak boldly, to question, to assert. These were dangers in skirts. The more a woman said, the more suspect she became. Silence, you see, was not merely admired, it was demanded. From the pulpit to the marketplace, the message was clear. A woman's mouth could bring ruin, her words likened to spells or snares. In scripture, Eve's speech led to downfall. In folk tales, the clever woman was often punished. And in daily life, those who spoke freely were mocked, shunned, or accused of worse. A tongue too sharp, they said, could mark a woman as a witch, and many suffered under that cruel belief. Even within marriage, silence was prized. A wife who corrected her husband or challenged his decisions risked disgrace. Some men beat their wives under the guise of discipline, and society looked away. Better a bruised wife than a noisy one, I heard a merchant say once, and none around him disagreed. That was the world they built, a world where silence was safer than truth. Girls learned early. I saw them taught to nod, to smile, to obey. If they asked too many questions, they were chastised. If they spoke out of turn, they were silenced. And so, they buried their voices, not just in public, but deep within themselves. Even their laughter, when it came, was often quiet, short-lived, as if joy itself might draw unwanted notice. In the church, women were expected to pray in whispers and sing only when allowed. They were forbidden to preach or interpret scripture. In town councils and courts, their testimony held little weight. Their thoughts were not considered reasoned, their insights not welcome. Even noble women, those with titles and land, were expected to remain decorous, which meant quiet. Yet silence did not mean peace. Many women burned with thoughts they dared not share, ideas, grievances, memories. They wrote poems and prayers in the margins of books, stitched secret messages into embroidery, confided in each other when the doors were closed. It was a quiet resistance, a language of glances and pauses, a world of expression that thrived beneath the surface. I remember a widow in a coastal town who never raised her voice. She was known for her stillness, her folded hands, her downcast eyes. But when her daughter was wrongly accused of theft, she stood in the square and spoke. One clear, trembling sentence. The silence that followed was louder than any shout. Sometimes, even one voice, long held back, can shift the wind. So it was in my time. The ideal woman was silent, not because she had nothing to say, but because the world refused to hear her. Yet even in silence, she endured, she shaped, she carried truths the world could not bear to name. And though her words may not have filled the halls of power, they echoed in kitchens, in cradles, in hearts. and in the memory of those who listened closely. In the world I walked, knowledge was a gate rarely opened to women. Learning was seen as a man's inheritance, a tool for clergy, scribes, and noble sons. Girls, if they were taught anything at all, learned only what served their station, how to sew, to pray, to manage a household in silence. Books were locked behind stone and status, and a girl's hands were deemed too delicate to turn their pages. Among peasants, schooling was a distant dream, even for boys, but for girls, it was almost unheard of. They learned from their mothers how to bake, wash, tend to infants. Letters and numbers were not part of their world. A woman who read was seen with suspicion. What need had she of written words, unless to stir trouble or question her place? Better she know her needle than her pen. Even among nobles, education was a privilege few women fully tasted. A noble daughter might be taught to read psalms or copy verses from a prayer book. Some were trained in French or Latin to manage correspondence, but always her studies ended where the boundaries of obedience began. Philosophy, logic, or science were considered unfit, too sharp for the gentler sex, too dangerous for the proper order. I once met a merchant's wife in Ghent who taught herself to read by candlelight, using old scrolls left by a brother long dead. She kept her books hidden beneath the floorboards, afraid her husband might burn them. Her eyes shone with quiet fire as she spoke of tales and histories. They never said I could, she told me once, but they never said I couldn't. Still, she lived in fear of discovery. The church, for all its libraries and learning, guarded knowledge closely. Monasteries and scriptoria were the realm of men. Nuns were sometimes allowed to read, but even then, their writings were censored. A learned woman might be praised for devotion, but scorned for inquiry. Many who dared to think too deeply were later branded witches or sinners, or worse, not for heresy, but for intellect. A few names reached my ears through whispers: Hildegard of Bingen, Christine de Pizan, women who wrote, who questioned, who taught. But they were exceptions, rare stars in a sky dimmed by silence. Most women's wisdom lived and died unrecorded, passed in hushed tones from mother to daughter, carried in lullabies, remedies, and stories told beside the hearth. And so, the minds of many were left to wither before they could bloom. Potential went unspoken, curiosity dimmed by duty. They were taught to accept, not to question, to remember instructions, not ideas. Their voices might have changed the world, had the world been willing to listen. But the ink of history was held in male hands, and those hands wrote little of what women thought. As I sit beneath the stars and feel the weight of memory settle in my chest, I grieve not only for the lives lost, but for the thoughts that never found form, for the books never written, the songs never sung, the truths that died in silence. In every woman denied education, the world lost a piece of itself, a light dimmed before it had the chance to shine. The cloistered walls of a convent could mean many things to a woman in my time: salvation, seclusion, punishment, or protection. For some, it was a sanctuary from marriage and childbearing, a place where the soul could breathe. For others, it was a lifelong sentence passed down not by judges, but by fathers eager to avoid a dowry or rid themselves of a daughter deemed too unruly. The veil offered safety, yes, but also silence. A convent was often the only path for a woman who wished to read, to think, to govern even in some small way. Abbesses wielded considerable authority within their domains. They managed lands, taught young girls, even corresponded with kings. I knew one such woman, stern, learned, and unshakably devout. Under her rule, the sisters worked, studied, and prayed in peaceful rhythm. But such freedom came at the price of complete obedience, a life sealed behind stone. Most women did not choose this path. They were placed there, sometimes as children, Noble families sent daughters to convents to avoid splitting inheritance or to curry favor with the church. I once met a girl of 11, dressed in white, eyes wide with uncertainty as she recited her vows. She had never kissed a boy, never known a garden without walls. Her tears were soft, not defiant, as though she had already accepted a life not her own. Daily life was austere. Bells marked every hour, from matins before dawn to compline at night. Meals were simple. Silence reigned. The rule of St. Benedict governed most houses, calling for humility, chastity, and continual labor. Some women found solace in this rhythm, a life of devotion unburdened by male authority. Others felt trapped, their minds pressing against the walls, their hearts longing for a world they could only see from behind grates. The outside world viewed nuns with a mix of reverence and suspicion. They were seen as holy, but also odd. Women without men, without children, without adornment. Stories grew in the margins of secret romances or hidden rebellions. But more often, their lives passed quietly, unnoticed. They buried each other in simple graves, their names forgotten even by the villages they once came from. Yet within those quiet halls, there were sparks. A nun might write hymns that reached distant cathedrals, or preserve manuscripts that would one day enlighten scholars. Some healed the sick with herbal knowledge passed through generations. Others defied the rules gently, sneaking books to younger sisters, questioning doctrine in coded prayers. Their resistance was not loud, but it lived nonetheless. Still, not all convents were safe. Some were poorly kept, led by corrupt abbots, or plagued by scarcity. A woman sent there might suffer hunger, illness, or neglect. And if she begged to leave, there was no door open. Her vows were binding, her life set. Many died within walls they never chose, their voices unheard beyond the cloister. So I remember religious life not as wholly sacred, nor wholly cruel, but as a place of contradictions. It was both refuge and prison, light and shadow. For some women, it was the only place to find a measure of control in a world that gave them none. For others, it was where freedom died behind holy stone. In the courts and records of the medieval world, a woman's presence was often a shadow. She existed in practice, but not in power. The law, written, interpreted, and enforced by men, rarely saw her as a full person. She could not vote, could not serve on a jury, and in many regions could not speak in court unless her husband allowed it. Her voice, even when raised, was barely heard beyond the walls of her own home. A woman's legal identity was bound to a man's, first her father's, then her husband's. She could not sign contracts on her own, could not manage land unless widowed, and even then, she was often pressured to remarry quickly, returning her property to male hands. In marriage, she became femme covert, a legal term meaning covered woman, her rights veiled beneath her husband's authority. In the eyes of the law, they were one person, and that person was not her. I remember sitting in a manor hall when a woman came to plead for her dowry, unpaid for years after her father's death. She spoke with care, her hands trembling as she clutched a parchment. The lord barely looked up. "Where is your husband?" he asked. She had none. The room fell quiet. Without a man to speak for her, she might as well have been invisible. She left with nothing. In rare cases, women did manage estates, usually as widows of lords or merchants. But even then, their actions were closely monitored. A decision too bold, a coin spent too freely, and murmurs would begin. She is reckless. Or she is a woman alone. The freedom given was temporary, conditional, and often resented. Even queens, with crowns upon their brows, had to fight for their authority, often facing opposition from bishops and barons alike. Inheritance laws were another chain. Sons took precedence, always. Daughters might receive a portion, a dowry, or a chest of linens, but seldom land or titles. If no male heir remained, land could pass to a daughter, but only until she married, at which point it became her husband's. A woman's lineage flowed not through her blood, but through the man she joined in marriage. In matters of justice, the imbalance was starker still. A woman accusing a man of harm had to present witnesses or bruises too severe to ignore, and even then, she might be blamed. Her character was weighed more than his actions. And if she was unmarried, or poor, or known to speak her mind, her chances of justice grew dim indeed. The law did not protect her. It preserved the order that kept her low. The church offered little remedy. Canon law mirrored civil law, often with added burdens. A woman seeking annulment or protection had to appeal to bishops who saw her through the lens of sin or purity, rarely as a human being with her own will. And those who defied the system were often cast out, their names lost, their stories twisted into cautionary tales. So the law became another wall, not of stone, but of silence. It marked what women could not do, could not own, could not decide. And in that silence, many lived their entire lives, working, weeping, praying, while the world moved on around them, scarcely acknowledging they were ever there. Not all women in the medieval world had homes of their own. Many served in the houses of others, as maids, cooks, wet nurses, and washerwomen. From dawn until far past dusk, they labored for those with coin or land, their hands red with soap, their backs bent by burden. These women were neither free nor enslaved in the legal sense, but their lives were bound by need and often by fear. Service for them was not a step, it was a cage. In noble households, female servants rose before their mistresses and retired long after them. They dressed others before tending to themselves, cleaned without praise, and endured reprimands without answer. Some were girls of 12, sent by their families in exchange for coin or favor. Others were widows with no other way to eat. They swept cold corridors, fetched chamber pots, and stood in silence, while nobility dined, hungry and still. Abuse was common and often invisible. A sharp word, a slap, a demand made in the dark. These were part of daily life. If a servant became pregnant, blame rarely fell on the master. More often, the girl was dismissed in shame, her future shattered. I remember a maid in Normandy, cast out in winter with swollen belly and no name on her child. Her employer, a knight, continued to attend mass, praised for his piety. In the countryside, some women were bondswomen, tied to the land like cattle, owned by lords who inherited their toil. Though not slaves in the Roman sense, they could not leave without permission, and their children inherited their status. Their lives passed in fields, kitchens, and cottages they did not own. If they fled, they were hunted. If they resisted, they were punished. Their labor fed the manor, but their names were seldom remembered. In towns, poorer women found work in taverns or spinning houses. These were places of both livelihood and danger. A girl might earn her bread, but she was exposed to drunkenness, harassment, and the constant threat of being sold into something darker. Some were promised positions, only to find themselves trapped in brothels or servant rings with no hope of return. Slavery, though not as widespread as in later centuries, did exist. Captives from raids, especially in border regions or through piracy, were sometimes taken as slaves, women among them, used for labor or worse. I met a Moorish woman once, brought to England in chains. She spoke little, but her eyes carried a sorrow deeper than sea or stone. Even in noble halls, she was treated as a curiosity, not a soul. There were those who showed kindness, a mistress who allowed a maid to rest, a monk who taught a servant girl to read in secret. But these were rare lights in a long corridor of darkness. Most women in service lived without rest, without voice, and without recourse. Their strength was mistaken for submission, their silence for consent. So when I hear of servants in songs or tales, I remember not the merry maids or loyal nursemaids, but the real ones, the tired, the bruised, the forgotten. Women whose lives unfolded in corners and cellars, who gave much and received little, and who bore the burdens of others while carrying their own with quiet dignity. When a man died in the Middle Ages, his absence was marked with bells, prayers, and black cloth. But when a woman lost her husband, her mourning was often shadowed by fear. Widowhood, though sometimes imagined as a state of quiet dignity, was in truth a perilous and uncertain passage. Without a man's protection, many women became vulnerable, not only to poverty, but to the cruelty of a society that valued them only in relation to a husband. I have seen widows cast from homes they had helped build. If the land belonged to the husband's family, the widow had no claim. Her children might inherit, yes, but only if male, and only with a guardian to act in their name. Until then, she was expected to step aside, to remarry quickly, or to enter a convent. Her own wishes mattered little. The law, the church, even her neighbors urged her toward quiet disappearance. Among the poor, the risks were greater still. A peasant woman who lost her husband might lose her only source of income. Few trades were open to her. Some turned to spinning or brewing. Others begged. I remember one widow who sold rushes door to door, her hands raw from frost, her feet wrapped in rags. She smiled when I spoke to her, but the lines on her face told stories of long nights and hungry mornings. Widows were often targets of harassment. With no man to speak for them, they were seen as easy prey for thieves, for dishonest landlords, even for lecherous men in power. A widow with no sons was especially vulnerable. The world called her free, but what freedom is there in fear? I heard tales of women accused of sorcery simply for living alone, or for surviving when their husbands did not. Independence was mistaken for suspicion. The church offered prayers, but few protections. A devout widow might find comfort in daily mass or in serving the sick. Some joined religious orders, but even there they entered last and were given the humblest roles. And always the church gently pushed them toward remarriage. A woman alone, they warned, is a danger to herself and others. In truth, she was a danger only to those who feared a woman with no master. Some widows did find strength. A few managed farms, ran inns, or even took over family businesses. I once met a tanner's widow who kept her trade alive for over a decade. Her neighbors respected her, but even so, she was never fully accepted. Whispers followed her, that she was too proud, too bold, too different. A man in her position would have been called shrewd. She was called troublesome. Yet despite the hardship, many widows endured with quiet grace. They raised children alone, nursed the sick, prayed for the dead, and kept the hearth burning when all else had turned cold. Their strength was forged not in choice, but in necessity, a resilience born of abandonment and survival. And though the world gave them little, they gave much in return. So when the fire before me crackles low, I think of them, women left behind, but not broken. Their steps were heavy, their burdens great, but they walked forward all the same. In the absence of their husbands, they carried the world on shoulders that history chose not to remember. Though I do, I always shall. In the Middle Ages, a man's desire was tolerated, even celebrated, while a woman's was feared and punished. The laws of morality did not weigh both sides of the scale. A man might boast of his visits to brothels, or speak of mistresses with a smile and a raised cup. But if a woman was even suspected of impropriety, her reputation shattered like stained glass. Purity, they said, was her virtue, and once lost, it could not be restored. Virginity in a woman was treated as currency, essential for marriage, tied to honor, and guarded fiercely by families. A girl's worth was measured by her chastity more than her character. Some were inspected for signs of virtue, their bodies scrutinized like objects in a market. If a man betrayed his vows, he might confess and move on. But if a woman erred, or was simply accused, the consequences could be cruel and lifelong. I recall a young woman in a market town, mocked and spat upon, for bearing a child out of wedlock. The father, a squire from a nearby manor, faced no judgment. She, cast from her home, was left to beg for food while nursing the infant. Her shame, they said, would cling to her like a second skin. Yet I remember her eyes, unashamed, only tired. Tired of a world that blamed her for what it allowed in men. Brothels, ironically, were sanctioned by many towns. They were regulated, taxed, and sometimes overseen by clergy. The women within them, often poor, often trapped, were tolerated but never respected. They were used, then condemned. A man who visited was seen as indulging a natural need. A woman who worked there was seen as corrupted, unworthy of marriage, unworthy of prayer. Desire in a man was appetite. In a woman, it was sin. Even within marriage, the imbalance remained. A husband could demand his wife's body, and the law would support him. If she refused, she could be punished. If he strayed, it was often excused. Love was not a requirement. Obedience was. Some women found kindness in their husbands, yes, but others bore coldness or cruelty in silence, with no right to protest. Their bodies were not their own. They belonged to the vows they had spoken. And yet, the double standard ran deeper still. A woman raped might find herself blamed for walking alone, for dressing wrongly, for not crying out loudly enough. The burden of proof was hers, and the shame too. In some places, if the attacker offered to marry her, the crime was erased. Her suffering was not seen as a violation, but as a stain on her marriageability. The law protected honor, but only the honor of men. In churches, images of saints and virgins looked down from painted walls, their eyes cast downward, their mouths closed. This was the ideal offered to women, pure, passive, untouched. And yet the world they lived in was anything but gentle. They were surrounded by contradictions, praised for beauty, punished for attracting attention, taught to be modest, then blamed when men faltered. So I remember the weight those women carried, not only in their hearts, but on their very names. They lived beneath a standard they did not set, one that judged them not by their deeds, but by their silence, their suffering, and their submission. And still they rose each day, washed, prayed, mothered, worked, and endured a world that watched them with one eye open and the other closed. It was not called violence then. It was called discipline, correction, a man's right. In the world I knew, the pain a woman endured was often seen as necessary, even holy. If a husband struck his wife, he was correcting her disobedience. If a father whipped his daughter, he was guarding her virtue. These were not crimes. They were customs, as old and rooted as the stones of the churchyard wall. I have heard the sounds. A cry behind a closed door, a muffled sob in a corner of the hall. They echo still in my memory, though few spoke of them aloud. A woman might be bruised, but she was also blamed. She must have angered him, they would say. She spoke out of turn. The violence was not hidden. It was expected. And its silence was enforced not by secrecy, but by shame. Public punishment was not rare. I saw women paraded through streets with shaved heads or torn garments, accused of infidelity or immodesty. Some were placed in stocks, their heads bowed as children jeered. Others wore scolds' bridles, iron cages for the mouth, meant to silence those who spoke too freely. Their crimes: a sharp tongue, a rumor, a refusal. Their suffering was spectacle, not sorrow. In the countryside, few authorities intervened. A lord might punish a servant girl as he pleased. A husband might beat his wife to near death, and no one would answer her cries. The church offered penance, but seldom protection. Priests preached forgiveness, even when bones were broken. Endure as Christ did, they would counsel. But I have seen endurance twist into despair. Even noble women, shielded by wealth, were not spared. I once rode in service to a baron whose wife bore bruises she disguised with lace. Her maids turned away. Her children learned not to ask. She moved like a ghost through gilded halls, her dignity intact, but her spirit dimmed. And yet she smiled at meals, kept the accounts, lit candles in the chapel each dawn. Her strength was never praised, it was merely assumed. When women fought back, and some did, they were rarely believed. Accusations of self-defense were turned against them. A wife who struck her husband could be executed. A daughter who fled was hunted. And a woman who killed in desperation was not called brave. She was called wicked, mad, possessed. The law did not ask what she had endured. It asked why she had dared resist. There were a few places of refuge, convents, kindly widows, hidden corners of villages where compassion still lived. But they were rare and not always safe. Most women had nowhere to run, no voice to raise, no hand to hold. They bore their wounds as quietly as their burdens, stitching their pain into the very fabric of their lives. So when I speak now of violence, I speak not of swords or battlefields. I speak of kitchens, bedrooms, alleys, and chambers. I speak of the harm done without glory, the wounds that bled without witness. And I remember not only the suffering, but the strength. The way women endured what should never have been asked of them, and yet carried on, lighting fires, singing lullabies, and surviving in a world that too often forgot their worth. In the darker corners of the world I knew, fear grew like ivy, twisting, creeping, choking reason. And when that fear took root, it often sought a woman to blame. She might be old or childless, or wise in herbs and healing. She might speak too plainly, or walk too freely. It mattered not. If crops failed, if children sickened, if the weather turned, the whispers would begin. Witch, they murmured. And for many women, those whispers ended in chains. The early Middle Ages knew of magic, yes, but it was not until later, as superstition deepened and the church's grip tightened, that fear hardened into accusation. A woman who once tended births and wounds was now seen as a threat. Her knowledge, passed down from grandmothers, became suspect. Her solitude became danger. What once marked her as a midwife or healer now marked her for death. I remember a woman in a small northern village. They called her Breeder. She knew the language of herbs, spoke little, and lived alone. When a noble's son died suddenly, the villagers gathered in rage. They tore her from her cottage and dragged her to the square. I arrived too late to stop it. Her house was burned. She was bound. Her only trial was fear, and her only defense, silence. She never cursed them, only looked to the sky. Torture was common. They believed that pain revealed truth, that a confession, torn from the body, carried divine weight. Women were stripped, prodded, broken. If they confessed, they were guilty. If they did not, the devil's silence was blamed. It was a net with no escape. The very air turned against them, and those who once accepted their help turned their backs in terror. Sometimes the accused were simply different. A widow who did not remarry, a girl who dreamed too loudly, a woman whose beauty stirred envy. Witchcraft became a convenient accusation, a way to explain misfortune or rid a town of an unwanted voice. The church sanctioned these fears, and even kings passed laws allowing trials. Books were written to instruct inquisitors on how to detect witches, as if grief, independence, or old age were marks of evil. Even noblewomen were not safe. I recall a lady of learning who was rumoured to hold secret texts. She vanished from her estate. Some said she was sent to a convent. Others whispered of a hidden grave. Her only crime was knowing too much, reading too widely. And so her memory was buried, like her books, as though her voice had never been heard. Some villages tried to resist the madness. A few priests spoke out. Some neighbours defended the accused. But the tide of fear was strong, and those who questioned it risked drowning in it too. Better to stay silent, to look away. And so, many women were lost, not to devils or curses, but to the hatred of their own kin. As I sit by the fire now, I remember their names, or the absence of them. I remember the ashes left behind in woods and fields, the silence of burned-out homes, the prayers whispered for women who were never granted peace in life. They were not witches. They were healers, dreamers, survivors. And the world, blinded by fear, destroyed them rather than let them live freely. In the world I once rode through, what a woman wore was never simply fabric. It was a message, a warning, a boundary. Her garments marked her station, her virtue, and her obedience. Every thread, every color, every inch of skin concealed or revealed was judged. Clothing was not for comfort, nor even for beauty. It was for control. A tool by which society reminded a woman of who she was, and more cruelly, who she was not allowed to be. Sumptuary laws they were called, decrees passed by kings, lords, and councils. These laws forbade women of lower rank from wearing certain materials or colors. Velvet, fur, even deep blues or crimsons were reserved for nobility. A merchant's daughter might wear fine wool, but never silk. A peasant woman could be fined, or worse, for dressing above her station. To cross the line of appearance was to challenge the order of things. Modesty, too, was strictly defined. A veil was expected, not just in church, but often in the street. Hair was considered dangerous, tempting, and so it was to be hidden. Shoulders, ankles, even wrists, any of these, if shown in the wrong context, could bring shame. And if a man lusted, it was the woman's garment that bore the blame, not his gaze. Her body was never hers to present, only to cover, to conceal, to discipline. I recall a young widow in Rouen who wore a red ribbon at her throat, a gift from her late husband. It caught the eye of a local bailiff, who deemed it too bold, too proud. She was summoned, scolded, and forced to remove it. Her grief was not questioned, only her decorum. Her small spark of colour was seen as rebellion. And in that world, rebellion had no place in a woman's wardrobe. Even within the home, clothing served to remind a woman of her role. An apron for the kitchen, coarse linens for the field, finer dress for the feast, but always humble, always subdued. A woman who adorned herself too richly was seen as vain. One who did not care enough was called slovenly. There was no winning, only balancing within tight constraints, and always under the eye of others. Among nuns, the habit was uniform, a mark of surrender. Among noblewomen, corsets and layers pressed their bodies into the expected mold. Freedom of movement was not considered. Their beauty, if noted, was to please others. Their discomfort was irrelevant. And should a woman step outside these expectations, by dressing like a man, or simply for her own joy, she risked ridicule, suspicion, or even accusation of heresy. The irony, I have always thought, was that while men fought wars and claimed to rule the world, it was women who bore the weight of constant judgment, not through law alone, but through hemline and lace. Their clothing became a prison of cloth, stitched with expectation and fear. What covered them also confined them. So now, when I see the glow of the fire dance across my cloak, I think of all those garments worn not for warmth or will, but to appease a world that would not let a woman simply be. And I wonder, had they been allowed to dress as they chose, to adorn themselves without consequence, what might they have revealed, not just in fabric but in spirit? A dowry, they called it, a gift, a gesture of goodwill, a symbol of union. But for many families it was a weight they could scarcely bear. And for countless women, it was the price placed upon their future. In the medieval world, a daughter's marriage depended not on her heart, but on what her family could offer: coins, land, livestock, or linens. Without it, she might never wed. And if she did, it might not be to a man of her choosing. Among the wealthy, Dowries were large and carefully negotiated, often recorded in ink and sealed with wax. They could include estates or city homes, tapestries, even servants. The larger the dowry, the better the match. But even in noble halls, I saw women passed like ledgers between fathers and grooms. Their value weighed not in character, but in coin. A daughter with a meagre dowry was a burden, one with none at all, a disgrace. Among peasants, the burden was harsher still. A family might toil for years to scrape together enough wool or hens to secure a humble union. Sometimes, siblings were denied so one daughter could marry. I remember a girl whose father sold his only cow, their milk, their livelihood, to offer a small chest of silver buttons and wool. Her tears on the wedding day were not of joy, but of gratitude laced with guilt. For women, the dowry defined their worth and shaped their fate. A generous one could earn respect, at least for a time. But it could also bring danger, drawing the interest of greedy or violent suitors. And once married, a woman rarely retained control over what had once been hers. Her husband could use it, lose it, spend it. She might never see it again, even if widowed or cast aside. If a woman was unmarriageable, for lack of dowry, for age, for poverty, her options dwindled. Some were sent to convents, their entrance fees a fraction of what marriage required. Others remained at home, helping raise nieces and nephews, living under the roof of brothers who saw them as dependents. And some, deemed burdens, were sent away or left to survive alone. Their silence became their sentence. Occasionally, dowries were reclaimed, if the husband died early, or if no children were born. But this was rare and often contested. I once saw a widow fight for the return of her dowry. The court ruled in favor of the husband's kin, who claimed it had been used in good faith. She left the chamber empty-handed. The fruits of her family's sacrifice vanished into dust. And yet, the custom endured for centuries, shaping lives with quiet cruelty. Women were taught to be grateful for matches made through dowries, even when they brought sorrow. And parents, caught in the trap of custom, bore the financial strain in silence. They loved their daughters, but they loved their honor more. And in that equation, affection rarely altered outcome. So when I walk through memories now and hear talk of love and union, I remember the coins exchanged behind veils, the fathers who wept in barns, the mothers who offered bracelets with trembling hands. And I remember the daughters, their futures sewn into purses, not prayers. The dowry was never a gift. It was a weight, carried by women whose choices were bought before they could speak them aloud. Though the world tried to keep women silent and apart, I often saw how they found each other, not with banners or swords, but with glances, touch, and wordless understanding. In kitchens, by wells, in fields and convent halls, women created spaces where truth could breathe. Beneath the weight of expectation and labor, they wove bonds of friendship, tender, enduring, and quietly defiant. Their resistance was not loud, but it was real. I remember watching a line of washerwomen by a riverbank, their hands raw from cold water. They laughed, shared stories, passed around healing herbs for cramps and fevers. No man commanded that laughter. It was their own, a brief reclaiming of joy. One offered advice on surviving childbirth, another whispered of a neighbor's cruelty. And through these small moments, they stitched a fabric of care the world never noticed, but could not tear. In childbirth, women gathered, not only to assist, but to support. The midwife, the mother, the neighbor girl who brought towels, each played a role. They sang songs, prayed together, shared oils and incantations handed down through generations. Even when death loomed, they stood together, holding hands, holding space. It was in these moments that sisterhood formed, not in protest, but in presence. Even in noble courts, I saw women find allies. A lady's maid might become her confidant, passing messages or shielding secrets. Noblewomen traded letters filled not only with scripture and news, but with coded words of sorrow, frustration, and hope. They sent one another gifts, a carved comb, a vial of lavender oil, tokens that said, "You are not alone." In convents, sisters formed bonds that lasted lifetimes. They sang side by side, tended gardens together, and studied in stolen hours. Some wrote under false names, recording their thoughts where they could not speak them. Their friendships were sometimes the only mirrors they had, reminders that they were more than their vows, more than their silence. Among peasants, women shared tools and bread, raised each other's children, covered for one another when exhaustion became too great. If a man struck his wife, a neighbor might intervene, or bring healing balm under cover of darkness. If food ran short, it was women who divided what little remained, ensuring children were fed first. These acts were not named heroic, but they were acts of survival and of love. They resisted not with revolt, but with endurance. By remembering herbs when men forgot them, by telling stories that kept memory alive, by passing on songs that soothed and strengthened. Each lullaby, each shared loaf, each comforting word was a quiet rebellion against the notion that they were weak or voiceless. They were not voiceless. They spoke, only in ways the world refused to hear. So when I recall the harshness of their lives, I also remember the light they gave each other. It was not loud, but it was steady. A candle passed from hand to hand. In the darkest corners of castles and cottages alike, it burned, not to destroy, but to preserve what little freedom they could hold. And in that flicker, I saw the soul of a strength deeper than any sword. The songs spoke of it often, minstrels strumming lutes beneath arched windows, knights pledging fealty to ladies in silken gowns, love blooming like roses in the spring. Courtly love, they called it. Noble, chaste, elevated. But those who sang such tales seldom spoke of the real women who lived behind the verses. For the truth was this: courtly love was a story men told, and women bore the consequences of believing it. In the courts of nobles, the idea of a lady inspiring a knight was celebrated. She was to be beautiful, untouchable, and ever modest. His longing was considered virtuous, so long as it remained unconsummated. Her role was to inspire, to elevate his soul through denial. But this placed her on a pedestal built more of control than of reverence. She was not seen as a person, but as an ideal, perfect, silent, passive. I watched knights write poems to women they barely knew, praising their eyes, their skin, their silence. They spoke of suffering for love, yet seldom asked what the woman suffered in return. If she refused their advances, she was cold. If she accepted, she was ruined. The rules were written by men, for men. Women were the canvas, not the artist, always seen, never heard. Peasant women were entirely left out of such fantasies. No one wrote songs for the milkmaid, the midwife, the weaver. Their lives were filled not with ballads, but with bruises, with births, with burdens. Yet even they heard the tales and sometimes dreamed. Dreams, however, were dangerous. For if a woman dared seek love, true love, not transaction, she risked being labelled foolish, or worse. Noble women, too, were trapped. Many were married young to older men they did not choose. A courtier's flirtation might seem sweet at first, but it could turn cruel. A rumour of impropriety could ruin a woman, while the man simply found another muse. I recall a young lady cast from court for exchanging letters with a poet. Her father disowned her. The poet wrote a final verse and moved on. She never married. The church condemned such love, and yet it flourished in secret, in glances, in dances, in half-finished letters. But it was never safe. Love was permitted only within marriage, and even then it was often secondary to duty. A woman's heart was expected to follow, not lead. If she loved too fiercely, she was warned. If she loved not at all, she was pitied. And yet, some women clung to these myths. They embroidered hearts into handkerchiefs, kept locks of hair from distant lovers, and wept for heroes who would never return. Their longing was not weakness. It was hope in a world that rarely gave them choice. Hope that somewhere beyond duty and silence, love might be something more than a bargain struck in shadowed halls. So now, when I hear the old songs, I listen not only to the melody, but to what it hides. Behind the poetry lies a silence, the voices of women who inspired legends, but were never allowed to write their own. And in that silence, I hear the truth, that courtly love was not made for them. It was a dream offered in place of freedom. And still, they dreamed, because sometimes dreaming was all they had. Beauty, in the world I once rode through, was not simply admired. It was weighed, watched, and weaponized. A woman praised for her face or form often bore a burden with it. For beauty, though fleeting, was treated as both gift and curse. It could elevate a peasant to the eye of a lord, but it could also condemn her. A lovely woman was seen as a temptation, a threat, a cause for sin, and she was blamed for the desire she never asked to inspire. Men spoke of beauty in riddles, calling it divine, yet dangerous. The church warned that it was vanity. Poets called it grace. Yet both used it to explain their own impulses. If a man faltered, if his gaze lingered too long, the fault lay not in him, but in the woman who bewitched him. Her face became a cause, her presence an excuse. And too often, punishment followed admiration. I remember a girl from a village near Toulouse. Her hair was golden as wheat, her voice gentle. Men traveled to see her, bringing gifts, proposals, even threats. She married young to escape their stares, only to find herself locked away by a jealous husband who could not bear that others looked upon her. Her beauty became a cage, one with no bars, but many walls. Some women tried to hide it. They veiled their faces, wore rough cloth, smeared ashes on their skin, anything to avoid attention. Others, unable to escape it, learned to navigate its dangers. They spoke softly, stepped lightly, made themselves small, and yet, no caution could shield them fully. A man who sought to possess would not be stopped by silence. And if she resisted, the world might say, she led him on. Even noble women were not safe. A queen too admired could be accused of witchcraft. A lady beloved by many might be seen as a schemer. Beauty did not bring power, only scrutiny. And if illness, childbirth, or time altered her face, her worth in others' eyes often faded. What had been praised turned to pity or mockery. A woman was not allowed to age gently, not if her beauty had once been her crown. Women who used their looks to gain advantage were judged harshly. A merchant's wife who charmed clients, a barmaid who flirted for coin, they were called cunning, immoral, dangerous. Yet no such judgment was passed on the men who responded. Society feared the power of beauty in women because it was a power men could not fully control, and thus they tried to punish it. I saw beauty ruin reputations, stir riots, start wars. Helen was not the only one. In every court and village, whispers followed the beautiful, envy, desire, suspicion. And through it all, the woman herself remained unseen. Her thoughts, her pain, her longing, all eclipsed by her appearance. She became a mirror in which others saw only their own reflections. So when the fire flickers and the wind presses gently through the trees, I think of those women, praised and punished for the curve of a cheek, the glint of an eye. They were not statues or spells. They were human, and if they had power, it was one they never asked for and rarely kept. Beauty fades, yes, but the wounds left by its burden can linger far longer than any reflection in a glass. In the medieval world, a woman who worked beyond her household duties walked a narrow path, one bordered by necessity on one side and suspicion on the other. Labor was expected within the home, yes, weaving, baking, tending children. But when a woman stepped into the public sphere to earn coin, she stepped into danger. Her effort might feed her family, but her independence often drew scorn. I saw many women labor in markets and workshops. Some sold thread, others brewed ale, baked bread, or kept inns. In cities like London or Bruges, widows often took over their late husbands' trades. There were female butchers, apothecaries, and moneylenders. Their hands were skilled, their minds sharp. Yet the more capable they proved themselves, the more uneasy their neighbors became. A woman's success was rarely celebrated. Instead, it raised questions. How did she gain such knowledge? Whose favor did she seek? Did she charm her way ahead? The idea that a woman could prosper through skill alone threatened a world built on male authority, and so rumors grew like thorns around every coin she earned. If her bread sold better than a man's, perhaps it was enchanted. If her business thrived, perhaps she stole or sinned. The church, too, offered little comfort. It praised female modesty, not enterprise. A devout woman was expected to serve, not lead. And if she did lead, in trade or craft, she risked being seen as proud, even dangerous. I knew a brewer's wife who was summoned before her town council after her ale outsold every man's. She was fined for using improper measures, though none could prove it. Her crime was success. Some women worked simply to survive. Orphans, deserted wives, the poor. They had no other choice. Yet even then, they were watched. A washerwoman who spoke too boldly might lose her customers. A female merchant who travelled alone invited gossip. Even nuns who copied manuscripts were sometimes warned not to think too deeply. Knowledge, like gold, was guarded and rarely shared with women. And yet they worked. They rose before the sun, haggled prices, sharpened tools, balanced ledgers. They carried the weight of suspicion as surely as their baskets. Some endured insults, others withdrew. A few pushed back, quietly, cleverly, with alliances and persistence. But none escaped the judgment entirely. For in a world where obedience was prized above ability, a working woman was always watched. The contradiction was cruel. Society needed their labor, yet despised their independence. Men relied on their skills, yet questioned their ambition. And so, women learned to walk carefully, heads bowed, but hearts resolute. They built lives from scraps, businesses from necessity, and legacies from silence. So when I think of the women who worked with more than hands, who used wit and will to survive, I remember their courage, not loud or lauded, but constant. They labored not just for bread, but for a place in a world that tried to deny them one. And though history seldom writes their names, their efforts remain, carved not in stone, but in the lives they held together, one stitch, one sail, one silent triumph at a time. To be a mother in the Middle Ages was to live without pause. From the moment a child stirred within her womb to the day she closed her eyes for the last time, a woman's life was marked by constant giving. There were no breaks, no seasons of ease. Her days were filled with nursing, rocking, scolding, feeding, mending, a cycle so relentless it left little room for thought, let alone rest. I watched women cradle infants while stirring pots over open flames, hoist toddlers on their hips while sweeping muddy floors, tend to sick children with weary hands, even when fever burned in their own blood. No matter how many little mouths cried out, she was expected to soothe them all. Her body was their shelter, her time their nourishment. And when she faltered, the world rarely offered help. Among the poor, where life was harshest, mothers bore child after child, often with barely a year between births. There were no midwives, no medicines. A woman might give birth in the same room where her older children played, then return to chores within days. Milk was shared between infants when supply ran thin. Food was rationed, sometimes withheld from her own plate so that her children might eat. Grief was a constant companion. Many mothers lost children in infancy, to fever, hunger, or winter's cruel breath. I once saw a woman bury her third child in as many years. She kissed the tiny brow, then returned to the hearth without a word. Her tears would come later, if at all. The living still needed her. There was no time to mourn when another babe was crying, or when firewood needed gathering before dusk. Even among the well-off, motherhood brought no peace. Noble women were expected to produce heirs and manage households, often under the watchful eye of husbands and servants alike. If they failed to bear sons, they were blamed. If they bore too many daughters, they were pitied. A woman's fertility was treated as a measure of her worth, praised when it produced strong boys, questioned when it brought hardship. There was no language for postpartum sorrow, no understanding of the weight that sometimes followed birth, the hollow ache, the quiet dread. If a mother grew distant or despairing, she was called ungrateful, unnatural. The pain she carried inside had no place in a world that saw motherhood only as duty, never as struggle. And yet, they carried on, each day met with weary strength. Mothers taught without books, healed without training, comforted without comfort. They passed on prayers, songs, and whispered wisdom. Their love was rarely spoken, but lived, in worn hands and quiet gestures, in the last piece of bread always given away. They had no monuments. Their names were seldom remembered. But every soul that survived did so because of a mother who refused to rest. So when I look into the coals of this fire, I see the shadows of those women, bent but unbroken, grieving but unyielding. Their arms cradled the future, even as their backs bore the weight of the present. And in their quiet, tireless love, they carried a strength no sword could match and no history could truly measure. When war came, as it so often did in my time, it took men to the battlefield and left women with the wreckage. They did not wear armor or ride into glory, yet they faced their own kind of siege. With husbands and sons gone, women were left to defend the home, manage the fields, and protect the children. And when famine followed, as it nearly always did, their suffering was silent, steady, and rarely recorded. I saw it with my own eyes, women patching roofs with mud while arrows flew overhead, burying the family cow after it was stolen by soldiers, sleeping beside doors with knives hidden beneath straw. In war, their work doubled, then tripled. They sowed fields while scanning the horizon. They hid food, not for themselves, but for the little mouths they counted each night, praying none would go hungry before morning. In times of famine, their strength was tested even further. When the rains failed or the harvest rotted, it was mothers who ate less first. I remember a woman in Burgundy who boiled bark and nettles into thin soup, feeding it to her children while chewing on nothing. Her ribs showed through her gown. She smiled as they ate, but her eyes were hollow. Hunger became her shadow, always present, never loud. War brought danger, not only from afar, but from within. Soldiers, friend and foe alike, sometimes turned their swords on civilians. Women hid in barns or cellars, shielding their children with their bodies. I heard tales of entire villages where the women fled to woods and caves when troops approached. Their lives were valued only for what could be taken: food, shelter, flesh. And when peace returned, they returned too, to rebuild what had been burned. Even noble women were not spared. Castles might offer stronger walls, but not stronger protection. A lady might be left in charge of lands while her husband marched east or north. She balanced accounts, negotiated with bailiffs, and prayed nightly for the return of letters bearing his seal. If he died, her task became permanent. If he lived but failed, her burden often worsened, as defeat brought ruin with it. Famine stripped away the last layers of dignity. Without grain or meat, even those once secure grew desperate. Women gathered acorns, bartered scraps, and waited in long lines at monastery gates for a crust of bread. And still, they tended others first. The sick, the aged, the young. Their own hunger was hidden behind aprons and duties. Their pain was masked by perseverance. In these moments, I saw a kind of heroism the world did not honor. No songs were sung for the mother who fed six with nothing, or the girl who drew water from a frozen well while wolves howled in the woods. But they endured. They adapted. They found ways to survive in landscapes that seemed determined to forget them. So now, when I remember war, I do not think only of the clash of blades or the banners in wind. I think of the women who stayed behind, who stood against hunger, fear, and sorrow with nothing but bare hands and unyielding will. They did not fight for glory, they fought for life, and without them, nothing would have remained for the men who returned. In the eyes of the medieval world, a woman's purpose was clear: to bear children. Her womb was seen not as her own, but as a vessel for heirs, for labourers, for the continuation of bloodlines and property. And when that womb failed to produce life, the world turned cold. A barren woman, whether noble or peasant, carried a quiet shame that weighed as heavily as any burden of the body. I remember the looks they were given, sympathetic at first, then suspicious. Whispers followed them in markets and manor halls. What sin lies beneath? What curse has fallen? No one questioned the husband. Even if he was aged or ill, the fault was assumed to be hers. Her body became an accusation, her silence a confession. She walked among others, but always apart. In noble circles, the stakes were higher. A queen without an heir faced disgrace, even exile. Some were set aside, their marriages annulled in cold legal language. Others remained in place, enduring their husband's scorn or indifference, while mistresses bore the children they could not. Their titles remained, but their influence waned. I knew one such lady who lit candles each night, not for favour, but for a child who never came. Her prayers, like so many, went unanswered. Among peasants, the pain was no less deep. A woman without children often had no standing. She might be left out of village decisions, spoken of as odd or unlucky. If she worked, her earnings were assumed to be selfish. If she rested, it was said she had no one to care for. Her life, in their eyes, lacked meaning. Yet I saw these women offer kindness to others' children, tend gardens, care for the sick. Their nurture not absent, only unseen. The church, for all its talk of mercy, offered little comfort. Barren women were told to accept God's will, to repent for unnamed faults. Some were urged to join convents, where their childlessness could be turned into spiritual motherhood. Others were left to find solace in prayer, though often what they needed was simply to be believed, to be held, to be allowed to grieve. Some sought remedies, herbs, rituals, even pilgrimages. They travelled miles to sacred wells, to shrines said to grant fertility. I saw one woman walk barefoot to St. Margaret's Chapel, leaving behind an offering and a lock of her hair. She returned hopeful, but no child came. Still, she returned again the next year. Hope, you see, is not easily extinguished, even when stoked only by ashes. There were women who chose not to have children, rare and rarely understood. They were seen as selfish, unnatural, even dangerous. Their independence was feared, their solitude mocked. Yet I met a few who lived contentedly, growing herbs, writing prayers, or simply walking freely in the woods. They were not broken, only different. And that difference frightened the world more than any failing womb. So now, when I think of those women, their empty cradles, their quiet strength, I remember not what they lacked, but what they gave. Compassion, wisdom, endurance. Their worth was never in what they bore, but in how they lived. And though history tried to erase their voices with silence, I hear them still. In the wind, in the earth, in the quiet places where longing and peace meet. A marriage vow in my time was not a union of equals. It was a contract of command and obedience, and the woman was the one expected to bend. From the moment she said, "I will," her will ceased to be her own. The church taught it, the law upheld it, and society enforced it. A wife was to obey her husband in all things, without question, without resistance. Her body, her voice, her choices, all passed into his keeping. The teachings were clear. Priests preached that a man was the head, and the woman his rib, to be sheltered, yes, but also subdued. Disobedience was sin. A wife who contradicted her husband risked punishment not only from him, but from the moral judgment of her neighbors and clergy. I heard sermons where the husband was likened to Christ and the wife to the church, expected to serve with silent devotion. In practice, this obedience took many forms. A woman could not refuse her husband's wishes, even in the bedchamber. The idea of consent did not exist as we now understand it. If she resisted, she could be accused of defiance, or worse, of endangering his soul by denying his rightful place. Her duty was seen as sacred, even if it broke her spirit. And when she bore the weight of his desires in pain or fear, no one came to her aid. I remember a blacksmith's wife, bruised and quiet, who once told me with a downcast gaze, "He loves me best when I say nothing." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. Her neighbors pitied her, but none intervened. "It's between man and wife," they would say. The home was a man's kingdom, and what happened within its walls was his alone to govern. A woman could not manage her own earnings unless permitted. She could not leave the house without his approval in many towns. If she sought separation, rare and nearly impossible, she had to prove grave harm. And even then, the church preferred she return and submit with grace. Her obedience was not merely expected, it was enforced by law, custom, and theology alike. Some men were kind, yes, but kindness was a gift, not a requirement. A gentle husband was praised, but a cruel one was not condemned. The system protected him, not her. And so, many women learned to yield early. They quieted their thoughts, lowered their eyes, masked their resistance in silence. It was safer that way. Survival for them meant surrendering again and again, not because they believed, but because they must. And yet within that forced obedience, I saw glimmers of quiet defiance. A wife who hid coins beneath the hearthstone. A woman who whispered warnings to her daughters at night. A glance, a delay, a subtle turning away. Small acts of selfhood, smuggled into the day like contraband. They could not say no aloud, but they found ways to preserve a shred of yes within themselves. So now, as the fire before me burns low and steady, I think of those women, not as weak, but as bound. Their obedience was never chosen. It was coerced, carved into them by a world that mistook silence for agreement. And though they were forced to yield, many never truly surrendered. They endured not because they were lesser, but because they were told they must be, and chose to live, still, beneath the weight of that lie. Though the world tried to hush them, not all women bowed their heads. Some rose, not with shouts or banners, but with ink, with herbs, with quiet acts of courage. Their names were often erased, their deeds folded into the shadows of men's stories. But I remember them. They lived behind veils and walls, beneath laws and threats, yet still they defied. And their defiance, though seldom praised, planted seeds the world would one day reap. I recall a miller's wife in the north who organized village women to bake for the poor when famine struck. When the Lord's steward forbade it, she did it anyway, by night, in secret ovens. Bread, hidden in baskets, passed from door to door. She was never caught, but her name was whispered for years. The woman who fed us, they said. Not in rebellion, but in defiance of indifference. In convents, where silence was law, some nuns wrote under false names. They penned treatises, translated sacred texts, and challenged doctrine with quill and ink. One abbess I met quoted scripture to defend her sister's right to study, not for vanity, but for the soul's deep hunger. She was accused of pride, yet kept her post. Her words travelled farther than she ever did, copied by candlelight in cloisters far beyond her own. There were women who dressed as men to study or travel. Others fled arranged marriages, disguising themselves as pilgrims or servants. I met a woman in Calais who posed as a scribe's apprentice to avoid being wed to an old merchant. She wrote letters by night, saved her coin, and vanished before the wedding day. None dared speak of it, but the look in her mother's eyes told me everything. Pride and fear, tightly entwined. Some took up healing when it was forbidden. They brewed tinctures, delivered babies, eased fevers, even when the church called their knowledge heretical. One such healer saved my own squire from a festering wound. She asked no coin, only secrecy. Later, I heard she was accused of sorcery. Whether she fled or fell, I never learned. But I carry her gift still, and her courage. Even within marriage, defiance flickered. A wife who refused a cruel hand. A mother who taught her daughter to read in secret. A widow who refused to remarry, keeping her home against the pressure of kin. These were not the heroines of song, but they were no less brave. Their victories were quiet, personal, yet they mattered deeply to those around them. Sometimes defiance came through creation. Women wove forbidden symbols into tapestries, painted prayers into margins, or composed songs that masked lament in melody. I once heard a lullaby sung in a tavern, soft and haunting. Later, I learned it was a coded tale of a woman wronged, passed from voice to voice, never written down. Memory became their shield and story their sword. These women did not seek glory. They sought breath, space, a life not shackled to someone else's will. They knew the risks. Many paid dearly. But still, they acted. Not because they believed they would change the world, but because, in that moment, they refused to be changed by it. So now, when I sit beneath stars that once watched them too, I honor their names, even those history forgot. For their stories, though hidden, still stir in the wind and rise with the embers. They remind me that even in the darkest times, defiance has a voice, and it often speaks in a woman's quiet, unwavering whisper. Some women, silenced in life, found their voices only in death. Their suffering, their sacrifice, their steadfast faith were so profound that even the church, slow as it was to praise the feminine, could not turn away. These were the saints and martyrs, women who bore pain not for men or kings, but for God. And yet, even in sanctity, their stories were shaped by the same forces that had bound them in life. I remember the tales passed through monastery walls and village hearths of Agnes, who refused a wealthy suitor and was martyred, of Catherine, who debated scholars and was broken on the wheel. Their lives were offered as examples, but always with a message. Holiness for a woman came through submission, purity, and pain. A sainted woman was one who endured, not one who defied, unless her defiance served doctrine. And then there was Joan. I never met her, but I remember the fear and awe her name inspired. Joan of Arc, a peasant girl who claimed visions, who led armies, who challenged the very order of kings and priests. She rode in armor, spoke with authority, and dared to believe that God had chosen her. For a time, they followed her. Then they burned her. Her ashes rose above Rouen like a cry too long stifled. Later, the same church that condemned her made her a saint. Such is the paradox of holy women. They were praised, but only after they suffered. Their courage was named divine, but only once it could no longer challenge the world that had killed them. Their stories were recorded, but often reshaped, softened, cleansed, stripped of rebellion. A virgin martyr who refused marriage became a symbol of chastity. A healer who spoke of justice became a tale of obedience. I once visited a shrine to a local saint. A woman said to have fed the poor with stolen bread from her lord's kitchen. The townsfolk left candles and small loaves in her honor. Her story, though simple, bore the same theme. She gave, she suffered, she was sanctified. Yet I wondered, did she want that suffering? Or did she have no other choice? Did she long for sainthood, or simply for freedom? There were women who lived holy lives without recognition, nuns who tended the dying, anchoresses who prayed alone in stone cells, midwives who sang psalms while delivering life into pain. Their holiness was not recorded in books, but it shone in the lives they touched. And in their quiet service, they showed a different kind of martyrdom, not of fire or blade, but of steady, unrelenting love. Yet the path to sainthood, even for the few who were recognized, was steeped in sacrifice. It asked not just for faith, but for the offering of the body, its labor, its wounds, its silence. Holiness for women came at a price higher than most could pay. And when paid, it was used to teach other women how to remain within the walls, not how to break them. So now, when I pass by chapels or hear the ringing of bells, I think not only of saints on pedestals, but of the flesh and blood women beneath the legend. Women who prayed, who wept, who dared to act, and who were only called holy once they were no longer feared. Their light still burns, but we must remember it whole, not polished by myth, but burning with truth. Long before physicians in robes and rings held sway, it was women who carried the knowledge of healing. In cottages, fields and forest clearings, they gathered roots, boiled leaves, whispered prayers over wounds. Their medicine was born not of books, but of memory, passed from mother to daughter, midwife to apprentice, herbalist to neighbor. It was the wisdom of touch, of scent, of time itself, and for centuries it served a world that both needed and feared them. I watched them at work, women with aprons stained green, hands lined like bark. They knew which flowers eased fever, which bark calmed the womb, which oils soothed the dying. Their tools were simple: mortar, pestle, linen, fire. But their knowledge ran deep. Some could recognize illness by the breath, predict childbirth by the moon. They healed when no one else could. And yet, they rarely received thanks, only cautious gratitude, followed by suspicion. Their power, you see, was not easily controlled. A nobleman might summon a healer when his child fell ill, yet never invite her to dine. A priest might accept her herbs, then warn his flock against old women's magic. The church distrusted what it could not define, and since women's healing did not fit the Latin texts or theological order, it was branded superstition, useful in secret, dangerous in public. As fear of heresy and witchcraft grew, so too did the risk. The same woman who had eased a noble birth could be accused of consorting with devils if a child later died. A poultice that saved one life might be blamed for another's fever. Folk medicine, once respected, became a threat, not because it failed, but because it worked outside the sanctioned male world of learning. I remember one healer, old and stooped, who treated wounds after a skirmish near the border. Her home was filled with drying herbs and jars of tincture. She spoke little, moved steadily. One day, a child she had treated died, from an illness no herb could cure. Within hours, rumors began. She fled by night. Her cottage was burned. I never saw her again, though her cures were still used, quietly, by those who remained. Not all who practiced were persecuted. Some avoided notice by weaving their remedies into daily life. A tea for nerves, a poultice for aches. Others masked their knowledge with religious language, blessing each herb in the name of a saint. A few were protected by wealth or noble patronage, but always they walked a narrow path, one foot in service, the other in danger. And still, they healed. They wrapped bruises, delivered babies, calmed the dying. They whispered over colicky infants and guided breathless mothers back from the edge. Their medicine was not just herbs, it was presence, comfort, understanding. In a world full of pain and little mercy, these women offered something rare: care without power, knowledge without pride. So now, when the fire crackles and the scent of wood smoke lingers, I think of those healers. Their names are lost, but their wisdom lives on, in the hands of midwives, in the cupboards of cottages, in the breath of songs still sung in quiet kitchens. They did not claim to be wise, but they were. And the world would have been far colder, far crueler, without their gentle, stubborn grace. To those beyond the manor walls, noble women lived lives of ease, silk gowns, feasts, servants at every turn. But I have walked those halls, sat at those long tables, and seen what others missed. The silence behind the stone, the weight of wealth without freedom, the deep and gilded loneliness. A noble woman's world was not wide. It was narrow, watched, and often cold. From a young age, noble daughters were raised not to lead lives, but to serve lineages. Their movements were measured, their voices trained to please. They were taught languages and manners, embroidery and music, not for themselves, but to attract suitors. And when the time came, they were married off to forge alliances. Love was not expected. Choice was never part of the bargain. Once wed, they were often sent far from home, to strange castles where even the servants were unfamiliar. Their husbands, soldiers, lords, sometimes kings, might be away for months at war or court. In their absence, the lady managed the estate, yes, but under constant scrutiny. Her letters were read, her words were weighed, even her womb was watched. For every month without a child brought new pressure, new fear. I remember a countess who walked alone in the rose garden each morning, hands clasped tight. Her husband, a harsh and distant man, had not spoken kindly to her in years. She bore him 5 children, yet he kept a mistress openly. Still, she managed the household, taught her daughters, hosted banquets. Her loneliness hung about her like perfume, faint but unmistakable, and no one spoke of it. Even friendships were hard to hold. Noble women were often kept apart, their correspondence filtered, their gatherings formal. Affection was discouraged, rivalry sown. The court was a nest of watchful eyes, and a misstep, a word, a glance, a too close bond could lead to scandal. Some women wrote letters to sisters or mothers, seeking connection. Others turned inward, confiding only in servants or pets, or in the pages of journals never meant to be read. Books, when permitted, became refuge. Prayer books, romances, chronicles, anything to transport them beyond the walls. Some painted, some played music, some tended gardens with more love than they ever gave their husbands. These quiet acts of creation were their rebellion, their salvation. But they were also reminders of what they could not have, a life of their own. Not all were unhappy, of course. Some found companionship, even love. Some ruled lands in their husband's absence with wisdom and strength. But even then, their power was borrowed, temporary. And always there was the expectation. Be graceful, be loyal, be silent. The tower might have been made of marble, but it was still a prison. So now, as the flames dance low and the night draws in, I remember those women behind lace and curtain, not as ornaments, but as souls, longing, grieving, enduring. Their jewels hid sorrow, their gowns bore the weight of expectation, and their stories, though often overlooked, deserve to be heard, not for their titles, but for their truth. In the medieval world, a woman's life was a procession of judgments, quiet, constant, and often cruel. From the cradle to the grave, she was measured by rules she did not write. How she walked, how she spoke, how she dressed, how she mothered, how she grieved. All of it was watched. And at every step, the weight of morality pressed upon her shoulders like a mantle she never asked to wear. As a girl, she was judged for her innocence. Too loud, and she was wild. Too quiet, and she was strange. If she played with boys, she was improper. If she stayed indoors, she was proud. And so she learned early that there was no path that led to full approval, only a narrow space where scrutiny was less sharp, though never absent. As a maiden, chastity became her crown. Fragile, demanded, and easy to tarnish. A glance held too long, a rumor spoken in jest, a stain on her gown. Any of these could undo her. Her purity was her reputation, and her reputation was her future. If she fell short, even by false accusation, no dowry could cleanse her name. I saw girls cast out, not for sins committed, but for appearances misread. As a wife, she was judged by her obedience. Did she serve her husband well? Did she bear children quickly? Did she keep her tongue, her home, her figure? A failure in any of these could bring shame. A woman with no sons was pitied. A woman with too many daughters was blamed. A woman who challenged her husband was feared and often punished. As a mother, she bore the weight of her children's faults. If a son misbehaved, it was her failure. If a daughter was unruly, it was her reflection. If a child died, as many did, the whispers came. Was it something she did? Something she failed to do? Her grief was met not with comfort, but with suspicion. And still she carried on. Even in old age, there was no reprieve. An aging woman who grew sharp or outspoken was called bitter, even mad. One who kept to herself was deemed odd, perhaps even dangerous. Some were accused of witchcraft, not for what they did, but for who they had become. Women no longer needed, no longer pleasing, and thus feared. The church reinforced these judgments with sermons and scripture. Women were praised only through comparison, to Mary, never to themselves. Virtue was submission, holiness was endurance, and forgiveness was slow, if it came at all. A man's sins could be confessed and pardoned. A woman's failings lingered, sometimes forever, etched into the memory of her family or her village. I saw women break beneath this weight, and I saw others carry it with quiet grace. They did not seek to be saints. They simply longed to be enough, to be seen not as temptresses or servants or mothers of many, but as people. And yet, the world demanded perfection from them, while offering them no space to breathe, no room to fall and rise again. So, as the night deepens and the fire grows low, I remember the judgment they endured, not for crimes, but for being women in a world that feared their strength and punished their flaws. They were measured by standards no one could meet. And still, they loved, they healed, they endured, not perfectly, but beautifully and bravely, and too often alone. Though their voices were quiet and their names seldom carved in stone, the women of the Middle Ages sowed seeds that would one day grow beyond the walls built to contain them. In their silence, there was endurance. In their patience, a kind of wisdom. And in the cracks of their confined lives, something sacred took root, the slow, unseen beginning of change. I have walked through villages where daughters learned from mothers not just how to spin or knead, but how to question gently, how to remember stories untold by priests or kings. Lullabies carried warnings and wishes. Proverbs passed down held deeper truths. These were not rebellions in the open. They were roots threading through soil, silent but strong. They waited, and they endured. Within convents, women copied books that kept knowledge alive through wars and plague. They preserved not only scripture, but songs, poetry, healing lore. They did not shout their thoughts, but wrote them in margins, in careful Latin or rustic verse, trusting that someone, someday, might read and understand. Their ink was modest, but it did not fade. Among peasants, women whispered of fairness, of kindness, of what should be. They taught children that hunger was not a punishment from God, that sorrow could be survived, that strength could look like gentleness. They fed neighbors, comforted strangers, and buried the dead with dignity when no one else would. These acts, done in obscurity, lit a flame that flickered through time. Even in courtly halls, some women dared to ask why. A noble lady who taught her daughter to read, a merchant's wife who kept her own accounts, a queen who shielded the weak beneath her name. Small gestures, yet each a thread pulling against the loom of custom. The fabric did not tear, not yet, but it shifted. It stretched. And through those stretches came space enough to breathe. I saw resistance not in revolt, but in resilience, in a widow who refused to remarry, in a servant who saved for her own freedom, in a midwife who taught her apprentice the names of herbs and saints alike. These were not grand victories. They were sparks, and sparks, though small, can outlive storms. The change did not come swiftly. Centuries passed. But the seeds sown in those days, in silence, in kitchens, in hidden corners of chapels and fields, did not die. They were carried forward by daughters and granddaughters, blooming in times yet to come. And though history often failed to trace the roots, the truth remains. Much of what was broken began to mend because of the women who kept living, loving, and hoping beneath the weight of a world that tried to bury them. So now, as I gaze into the last glow of this fire, I think of them, not as victims, but as quiet architects of something better. Their hands shaped bread, cradled children, and turned pages that would outlive kings. Their strength was not in conquering, but in continuing. And in that, they planted the future, one whisper, one prayer, one act of courage at a time. The fire burns low now, dear traveller, its embers glowing soft and red. The night has grown deep, and above us, the stars shine with a quiet knowing, as if they, too, have listened to the weight of these memories. You have walked with me through the lives of women long past, women whose stories were buried beneath duty and dust, but who shaped the world in ways still felt, still heard, still sacred. Let us sit a moment longer in silence, not the silence of forgetting, but of remembering, of honoring, of allowing their strength to echo in the stillness. And now, as sleep begins to draw near, let your breath slow with mine. Let the burden of the past drift like smoke into the sky. You are here, you are safe, and the voices of those long-silenced women will rest tonight within you, not as sorrow, but as strength. Until our next fire, fellow wanderer, sleep gently and carry these stories with care.